Well, ICv2 put out a report that shows DC's market share jumped by over 4% over this past summer. And that's great news. It looks like DC is gaining ground, everything is working in their favor, and they're winning the market share war against Marvel Comics. But hold on a second, it's not quite that simple. They're not winning the war against Marvel, they're cannibalizing the entire market. While the headlines scream DC is surging, when you zoom in on the raw data from ComicHub and ICv2, which tracks global comic store sales, the real story is far darker. In the last quarter alone, DC gained a 4 full percentage point gain on the market, according to ICv2's report. Marvel was flat. So where did that 4% come from? Image, Dark Horse, and IDW. The small guys got pushed out. The absolutes are selling, but at what cost to the industry's diversity? This isn't competition we're talking about here, it's a structural realignment and who gets to put comic books on shelves. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're talking about this article that came out from ICv2 that said DC is gaining in market share across all the publishers in the Western periodical market, which is great. But the problem that we're seeing when you look at the numbers and really dissect what's happening is that DC isn't just taking a slice of a growing pie, particularly from Marvel. This is about them fundamentally rewriting the rules of what sells in the book channel. But here's the game-changing secret. We're going to break down the Q2 and Q3 numbers, identify the exact publishers DC squeezed out, and analyze the single product line, the absolute books. That is driving this entire dramatic shift. And we're talking in this case primarily about Absolute Batman, Absolute Superman, and Absolute Wonder Woman. The smaller titles, maybe not so much, but at least the Trinity is making a huge impact in ways that we didn't foresee. But before we get to the damage report, let's set the stage with the big, misleading year-over-year win. Let's start with the obvious elephant in the room. DC has had an outstanding year from Q3 of 2024 to Q3 of 2025, so in other words, the last 12 months. DC's market share leaped from 20.1% to a staggering 29.5%, and that's according to the ICv2 data. That's a 9.4 point jump in 12 months. It's monumental, driven by the aggressive absolute lineup strategy. Now they're legitimately close to breaking the 30% barrier that would put them on par at almost the same level as Marvel Comics. Not quite, they'll still be a few percentage points off, but pretty darn close. But here's the twist on that whole development. On the surface, this looks like a classic Marvel DC battle. Marvel did see their share dip from 39.9% to 36.6%, and that doesn't speak well for how well the Marvel lineup is doing when they're still supposed to be the market leader. Their books are floundering. Even their flagship alternate universe, The Ultimates, is floundering, and it's set to conclude in April 2026. We've had videos about this. Go search the channel. You'll see it for yourself. But the Marvel dip was slow and spread out. It didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't directly correlated to anything any other publisher was doing. The hot summer growth that drove DC to 29.5% came from an entirely different source. So if you're thinking that anytime DC goes up and Marvel goes down, that it's a one-for-one battle between the big two, which would seem to make sense, that's not the case here. The conventional wisdom on that topic is completely dead. The real story lies between Q2 and Q3 of this year. The overall market is up, which is great news. 27% in the first 8 months of 2025, as reported by Industry Analysis. This means we're looking at a rising tide where DC is simply taking the largest piece of the growth. But who got left behind in all those numbers? That's the key question. We need to stop framing this as a big two competition and start talking about market consolidation at the high end of the physical collected market. It's not just the big two, even though that seems to take up the lion's share of every conversation. It's everybody. It's everybody from Image, IDW, Boom, Dark Horse, Dynamite, everybody in between. They're all part of that system, even though we spend our time just talking about those two guys. But before we get too further, I have to ask you a quick question, specifically about DC's market share gain. Let's address the controversy and see if it makes sense to you. Is DC's market share gain, if it comes at the expense of the mid-tier and smaller publishers like Image and Dark Horse, a net positive or a net negative for the comic book industry? If you are a longtime comic reader and you are very much a DC fan or a Marvel fan, are you fine with those smaller publishers being pushed to the wayside and possibly cornered off into irrelevance? Let me know in the comments down below. I want to hear your take on it, and we'll discuss your answers in the next video if we get some good ones. All right, let's get back to the full article. The Absolute line is a premium high-gloss reprint format. The consistent reprinting and availability of these known quantities is what retailers who report their sales to ComicHub are consistently pointing to as the primary driver of DC's sales velocity. I mean, it shouldn't be any surprise to anybody, and that's really sort of a aha, big duh, no kidding moment. When you give them quality books on time and in a reliable fashion, that helps improve sales. And that also is reflected in the quarter-by-quarter data that proves this entire theory is true. The data is right there, available for anyone to check out on the ICv2 website. And it confirms that DC's success is really an Image Comics warning sign. Let's dig into the meat of the argument a little bit and really roll up our sleeves and figure out how the math is going to work out here. It's not particularly dry stuff because we're going to focus on the publishers and what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong, even call out a few titles as an example, but it's important to understand how we got to this place. The primary quarter, and we're talking about 4 quarters out of the year, that matters is Q2 2025 versus Q3 of 2025. So basically, DC gained exactly 4.0 points in that 3-month window. Marvel, they moved from 36.5% to 36.6%. So they lost 0.1%, a rounding error. Marvel did not lose any significant ground to DC. Now, you could argue that the quality and the entertainment factor and value of the DC books are much better than Marvel at this moment in time. I would agree with you on that. But if we look at sales, who's actually picking up the books, who's ordering the books, how are they moving, their volume, and all that, Marvel barely moved a blip. DC gained, but Marvel stayed static. So who coughed up that market share? Image Comics, according to the ComicHub rankings, dropped from 14.4% in Q2 to 11.9% in Q3. That's a 2.5 point loss for the undisputed leader in creator-owned content. That's not a correlation, that is direct transactional consequence. So in other words, the biggest loser so far in this announcement when we say DC is gaining market share, they did it primarily at the expense of Image. But Image wasn't the only one. Dark Horse Comics dropped from 3.3% to 2.7%. That's a 0.6 point hit right there. Now, for a smaller publisher, and admittedly Dark Horse is much smaller compared to Image, that is a significant drop, and that's very painful. IDW Publishing, which handles massive licensed properties like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, also suffered a dip. When you total it up, Image's 2.5 point dip and Dark Horse's 0.6 point dip, you're at 3.1 points of the 4 point gain. So just those 2 publishers alone are mostly responsible for DC's gain. So here's the evidence. DC's momentum is entirely fueled by cannibalizing the collected editions market that these mid-tier publishers rely on. Why are the absolutes so effective in this case? I mean, their absolute Batman doesn't compare to anything that's going on at Dark Horse or IDW. Primarily it comes down to price, value, and availability. DC is aggressively reprinting and keeping older premium stories like Absolute Batman available. They are directly competing with the high-priced, smaller-run collected editions from Image and Dark Horse. If you go to a comic store with $100, do you buy 3 new, high-quality, re-released DC hardcovers you know are good? Or do you take a gamble on 3 collected trade paperbacks from smaller publishers? The data suggests readers are opting for reliability. They want something that they know they're going to enjoy. They're not open to taking a risk because your money is much tighter these days. So in response, DC is providing premium packed content. So it's a perfectly valid business sense for why it's happening, but it's turning into a bit of a crisis. For readers who value new voices, new concepts, and new creator-owned stories, it's a big risk. And that risk is now translating into loss of sales and market share. Every dollar spent on an absolute reprint is a dollar that isn't funding the development of the next saga or the next Hellboy. The creative lifeblood of the industry is being squeezed to prop up DC's headline numbers. That realization changes the entire conversation. It's very good news for DC, but it's pretty much bad news for anybody who is a smaller publisher. The long-term implications of this new DC strategy are profound, and they fall into 2 camps. Threat on one side and opportunity on the other. The immediate threat is to the diversity of the comic shop itself. Retailers have limited space and limited amount of money. So when DC pushes an absolute reprint, that reprint takes a physical slot and a revenue slot that used to belong to an Image or Dark Horse comic. The margin for error in launching new high-risk creator-owned intellectual property is shrinking. Your money has to go further, so there's not a lot of room to take chances. This leads to more conservative publishing from Image, which is a tragedy for the art form. But then you have this other side, the opportunity side. This forces the mid-tier publishers to finally innovate their formats and distribution. They can't beat DC at the premium hardcover game. They need to explore digital subscription services, direct-to-consumer models, or completely different book formats altogether. This market pressure could ultimately lead to better distribution systems, which would be a benefit for the industry because there would be more diversity and possibly establish a parallel chain for people to get comics that don't necessarily want to spend as much money as they would on the DC or the Marvel side of the house. So what about Marvel? We haven't really talked about them. Where do they fit in all this? This puts the pressure directly on their collected edition strategy as well. If DC continues to dominate the high-end bookstore market, Marvel will be forced to launch an equivalent premium line with aggressive availability to recapture that spending. Is the Ultimate line going to do it? Well, based on their sales, maybe not, but that's where they're probably going to head. Otherwise, DC keeps draining the money pool from which all publishers draw. My prediction is simple, really, if you think about it. DC will hit that 30% market share next quarter, and Image dips below 10%. The changes to the market are still happening, and they're happening quick, so stay tuned for where that goes next. So there we are. We have the numbers. We're not going on guesswork. We're not going on feelings. We're not going with who we like better. The numbers speak for themselves. DC's win is a loss for the independent scene, a structural shift that demands attention because they're basically the safe choice. We've laid out the data, but now it's your turn. If you ran Image Comics right now, what is the one single format or strategy you would deploy to fight the DC absolute machine that's taking away your big piece of the pie? I want to hear your most aggressive, innovative ideas in the comments below. I'll be responding to the best ones. And if a few of them are pretty good, we're going to feature them in our newsletter and in the next video. So if you found this deep dive valuable, hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep delivering this level of granular analysis and make sure that we give you information that you won't find anywhere else. If you want to see our breakdown of Marvel's upcoming Ultimate launch strategy and whether it can stop DC's momentum, click the video on the screen that's right here. Now, go read comics, but read wisely. I'll see you next time for more comical opinions.